Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SCA's 33rd monthly Zoom presentation. My name is Brian Gallagher, and I am the Vice President of the Society for Commercial Archaeology. I will be your host tonight. Welcome to all our guests, and particularly followers of Intuit and Spaces. We're happy you took the time out of your winter evening to watch an SCA presentation. I hope you enjoy the show. And for anyone watching the recording of this episode of the SCA's monthly presentations who is not a member of the SCA, we earnestly ask you to consider joining. Funding for the various activities of the SCA comes almost exclusively from our membership. Just visit our website at www.sca-roadside.org.
This meeting is being recorded.
Now I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's presentation. Tonight, Bill Swislow will tell us about some of the country's oddest roadside attractions, those so eccentric that calling them works of art is the only way to do them justice. These places of intense creativity, whether a sculpture-filled yard or an immersive environment where every square foot of space is covered with art, are most often the work of individuals who create solely for the sake of their own pleasure or obsession. But some of these environments also have a commercial or other public dimension, even if it only evolved after tourists started stopping to gawk. We'll explore the most interesting of these sites and their creators. Bill Swislow, a founder and former executive at Cars.com, is a writer and art collector. Before joining Cars.com, Bill worked at the Chicago Tribune and at other media organizations. Besides operating interestingideas.com, he sits on the board of Intuit, which is the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art, and the Society for Commercial Archaeology. He has written about art for a variety of publications. He has written and published 2 books, Lakefront Anonymous, Chicago's Unknown Art Gallery, which documents the thousands of mostly anonymous rock carvings that line Chicago's lakefront, and Bizarre Bazaars, which collects oddball names of stores, restaurants, and other businesses. Without further ado, I'm going to ask Bill to unmute himself, if he can, and give us his presentation. Bill?
Okay, thank you. You can hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, good. I'm unmuted. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. As Brian says, we're going to be looking at some of the odder roadside attractions. Some of these are works of art that became tourist attractions. Some are tourist attractions that became works of art, and some are in a whole category of their own. So let's get going. Let me make sure. So, you know, if you're used to driving along the American roadside, you know there are a lot of weird artistic sites along the road. They're not all commercial. The one here, the Cadillac Ranch, might be the most famous of them all. It was actually built as a work of art by a group of artists in 1974. But our focus is going to be on places that are as strange as Cadillac Ranch, at least as strange as it was when it was first built. But in nearly every case, were built not as art or by people who thought of themselves as artists, at least until someone came along and told them they were. As Brian said in the introduction, these are most often the works of individuals who really created these things for their own pleasure or obsession, or maybe a fixation on some extreme way to attract traffic to their business. So we will see a variety of places, most of them commercial, although not all of them, as you'll see. So the most famous art environment by non-artists is probably Watts Towers in Los Angeles, in Watts. The towers are interesting because it's really a mystery as to what they mean or even what the maker intended. They represent 33 years of work by one man, Simon Rodia, who never really explained why he made them, other than he was quoted as saying, "I had it in mind to do something big and I did it." So Rodia died in 1965, but he abandoned this site in 1955 and just gave the property to a neighbor and walked away from it after having spent 33 years building these amazing, very tall towers. Like many of these sites, this one was almost lost. Many of them have been lost. This one came close to disappearing in the late 1950s when the city of Los Angeles wanted to tear it down as an earthquake hazard. There was a major battle over keeping the towers. They did the advocates did an engineering test that showed that the towers could withstand an earthquake. They were saved. So not only were the towers saved, but importantly, this raised awareness about the sites like Watts Towers, that there are, in fact, many of these around the country, in fact, hundreds around the country and the world. But tonight, we're not going to look so much at the Watts Towers of the world, but the ones that overlap with commercial archaeology. That is, the ones that were intended to be or quickly became commercial roadside attractions. And some of them are equally as impressive and equally as strange as Watts Towers. And some of them transcend either their artistic or their commercial nature, as we'll see. So we'll start with a site called Possum Trot. It was really, in some ways, no less obsessive than Watts Towers, but it was commercial from the very start. It was in the Mojave Desert near Barstow, California. As it happens for you commercial archaeologists, it was apparently just up the road from the very first Del Taco shop. But it started as a rock shop, a place to buy rocks, a place to buy cold drinks in the desert, very common in desert areas. But the makers, who were named Calvin and Ruby Black, who had moved to California, I think from somewhere in the Mid-South, they added something that made Possum Trot different than the average rock shop, and they called it the Fantasy Doll Show. And they made 80 dolls by hand that they then staged in this tourist trap from about 1953 to the 1970s. I will note, as we go through, I will note here that you'll see that the photo credit is Seymour Rosen Spaces Archive, Spaces being one of our partners tonight, founded by Seymour Rosen. And Seymour was very much involved in the effort to save Watts Towers. And as a result of that, he became interested. He was a professional photographer who became interested in sites like these all over the country. And we'll see some more photos from Seymour as we go through it, because he photographed these extensively. So as you can tell from both of the pictures I just showed, this one and this one, Possum Trot was the kind of weird rundown tourist trap that no sensible parent would ever stop their car for, even if it was only a quarter to see the Fantasy Doll Show. But the Blacks stuck it out. They made, as I said, they made these dolls by hand, and you can see some of the dolls here. Calvin had learned ventriloquism as a young man, so he did the voices, and there are recordings of him doing the voices for the Fantasy Doll Show. Calvin died in 1972, Ruby in 1980. Possum Trot itself was long ago disassembled, so it's not there anymore. What you can see here is what you can see of it is in these pictures. The dolls themselves, though, are now sought after art objects that are in many collections. And they sell for thousands of dollars each. And we'll see some more examples of similar phenomenon shortly. So here's a case of what began as a tourist trap and really became a work of art, an environmental work of art filled with the creations of the Black family, of the two Blacks. So there was another rural couple with an oddball idea in the other part of the country, in central Iowa. They were named Grace and Clarence Woolsey. They were from Rhinebeck, Iowa, which is near Waterloo, Iowa, sort of middle of nowhere, unless you're an Iowan, in which case it's right in the heart of Iowa. In the 1950s and 60s, they accumulated piles and piles and piles of bottle caps. A lot of people saved bottle caps back in the day. These are the serrated crown caps from, not the plastic ones. In the early 1960s, Grace had a dream about doing something with the bottle caps, and specifically, she had a dream about making sculptures with them. Grace was a crafter. I mean, the Woolseys were they worked on farms. They didn't own a farm, but they were farm workers. Grace was a crafter. She made things out of egg cartons and tin cans. So she had this idea of what they could do with the bottle caps. And you can see an example in this photo here. That's Grace and Clarence. And you see all these farm buildings that they made out of bottle caps. So starting in the 1960s, they started doing something with their bottle caps and making these objects. In addition to the farm buildings, they made about 100 of these figures. Most people call them bunnies. They did 100 of these. And according to the local newspaper, in total, they made about 400 pieces, different kinds of figures and objects out of bottle caps. Here are some more examples of these bunnies, or sometimes they look kind of like aliens. This is from a 2016 exhibit at Intuit, our other partner for the night, showing the work of the Woolseys. But they had this idea not just to make these, but they decided that what were they going to do with them? Because what do you do with 400 of these bottle cap pieces and 100 of these figures? Well, you open a tourist trap. And that's what they ended up doing. Before I get there, though, I should mention this slide. That's Grace with the full-size bicycle they made out of bottle caps. And that's that same bicycle that Intuit showed in 1994 at a show of bottle cap art, along with many, many other bottle cap artists. You know, I don't think the bicycle probably didn't work, but it's full size. I've seen it in person. But their idea was to create a tourist trap. So in 1971, they rented a space in Lincoln, Iowa, which you can kind of see on the map here, not too far from where they lived. And they opened what they called the world's largest bottle cap arena, or Cap Arena. This was in 1971, and they were going to charge 25 cents to get in and see this incredible collection of bottle cap work that they had labored through the 1960s to produce. These are some photos, actual photos from the bottle cap arena. So it was not a highly polished environment. You can see they put up shelves, they put figures and objects on them. I will note that if you look on the upper left, that object with the pyramid and the cross on top is in my attic as we speak. Unfortunately, they opened the bottle cap arena, and then Clarence had bad health, and they closed it not too long after. So this tourist attraction was only extant for, I think, a couple of months before they had to close it down. Clarence died in 1987, Grace in 1992. Now, all these pieces from the Cap Arena and whatever else they had out of bottle caps ended up getting stored at Grace's brother's farm. And then the brother died in the early 1990s. The farm was auctioned, and everything the Woolseys had made, all the things you see here, the 100 bunnies, were all sold at the auction. And as the story goes, it was all sold, all of it, for a total of about $100. No one viewed it as having any value. It was just basically scrappage. However, it was sold to antique pickers and dealers who they knew they had something. And it went through a chain of dealers and pickers. Within 6 months of the auction, these figures, like the one here, were being sold in New York City at the Outsider Art Fair for thousands of dollars. Now, this one, I suspect, did not go quite for $8,000. They're not quite that valuable, but these things still go for thousands of dollars. I will also note that the attribution on that picture should be to Clarence and Grace. Grace kind of thought up the objects, and then Clarence built them. But the point here too is that, like so many things we see on the roadside, like collectible neon, these kinds of places we're looking at tonight also can have an afterlife among collectors and museums, like the Possum Trot dolls, like the Woolsey figures, which, it's a lot better when you see them in place, but at least the art objects themselves survived. So two tourist traps that were intended to be tourist traps. Here's a third one that's more of a roadside attraction as opposed to a tourist trap. I suspect it probably mostly serve locals, but it's in the theme of bottle caps. This is the world famous, as you can see, Bottle Cap Inn. It's one of my personal favorite roadside attractions and art environments. This was at 119th Street and 18th Avenue in Miami. So it's sort of out in the neighborhoods of Miami. And you can, of course, see that it was famous. It was featured in Ripley's. And as we'll see, we'll see a couple examples. They put out tons and tons of postcards promoting the world famous Bottle Cap Inn. This was the maker. You can see in this press photo, Joe Weiser. He was a disabled World War I veteran, and he had an idea for making his tavern stand out, which was covered everything inside with bottle caps. Postcards that he published and others published later claim he used more than 4 million bottle caps to decorate the place. I'm a little skeptical of the 4 million number, but you can see a lot of bottle caps, and we'll see a few more. There's Joe with his wife actually putting bottle caps up on the ceiling. Even though the photo stage, you can see there's a blank strip there, so he's actually doing the work. He covered every part of this bar, including this is the front bar. There was a large back room. The walls and ceilings were completely covered with bottle caps. You can see the cash register, bottle caps. There's a lampshade sort of in the back, bottle caps, bottle cap curtains across the windows. He had a piano he covered with bottle caps. It was impressive. Unfortunately, the day I was able to visit, it was closed, so I could only see the sign on the outside, although they still had a nice neon sign. At some point, he added color. This is not in the earlier photos, but you got to love the pizza pie and the colors. Weiser died in 1964, but he had already sold the bar many years earlier. It went through multiple owners, but it was still operated in the 1990s, which is when I drove by, at least to see the outside of it, if not the inside. Unfortunately, it eventually went out of business. The building became a church. You can see the remnants of you can see the outline of the building on the left. And in 2012, it burned down, a fire that was blamed on fireworks. So that was the end of the Bottle Cap Inn, but it is well documented in a big series of postcards that you can still acquire on eBay if you're interested. A similar obsession and another tourist attraction is in Rockport, Maine. It's called the Paper House. Some of you may be familiar with this site. It's still operating as a tourist attraction today. It's a house where the walls and furniture are all made from paper. Rockport, by the way, is on Cape Ann, north of Boston. It's a little east of Gloucester. So there's the gentleman who made it, Alice Stenman, who was a mechanical engineer, best known for designing machines that made paper clips. But in the 1920s, he built this house in Rockport, and he decided to use paper to insulate the walls, which is not uncommon. If you see old WPA photos from the South, you'll see a lot of sharecroppers insulated their walls with paper. But he took the idea further. So this is a vintage photo of the Paper House. And here you can see the inside and the outside. So on the inside, you see the clock. And if you look closely at that clock, you will see what look like the little logs are actually rolled up newspapers. You can see the headlines under the clock face. And then on the right, you can kind of see how he papered the walls with paper for the insulation. But he built it as a curiosity, but people started coming by as he was building it. And it really became a museum in the 1930s while he was still alive. And then after he died, the family took it over and they charged a fee. In 1942, it was 10 cents to visit the Paper House. So he built this as sort of an eccentric project. It became a tourist attraction. And if you ever go there, get a chance to go there, it is a work of art. I mean, he created these amazing, eccentric, one of a kind pieces of furniture. And plus the walls themselves, obviously the lacquer drains the color out of them, but it's really fascinating to sort of look at the newspapers that line the wall of this house. There's the house today. It's still open. The family still owns it and still open to visit. So you can go see the Paper House on most days. So obsession is a common ingredient in many of these sites, commercial or otherwise. In this case, the Coral Castle, which is now in Homestead, Florida, was built by Edward Leeds Skelman, who was from Latvia. He began building it in 1928, and he spent about 28 years working on it. He died in 1951. It was created out of heartbreak. His story was that he was jilted the day before his wedding. I think this was back in Latvia. And when he came to the United States, he decided to build, I think to work out his grief. And he built what is widely viewed as sort of a home out of coral that someday maybe his former fiance could reunite with him, and there would be this wonderful, bizarre home. So created out of obsession and heartbreak. There's a broader view of it. He was from a family of stonemasons, so he sort of knew what he was doing with the coral. But what's amazing, and you can get a sense of how huge this is, these pieces of coral are. I mean, there's a person, whoops, there, well, that's even better. These are immense objects, and he mostly put them in place by himself. He had minimal help. He did have help, as I understand it, moving these blocks about 10 miles, because he originally was building this somewhere else down the road. And he moved it about 10 miles to Homestead, Florida, where it lives today. And I believe he had help moving them. But a lot of these big, huge pieces of coral had already been cut out and sculpted when he moved them to Homestead. But for him, it was this obsession. But like the other creators that we've already looked at, whoops, excuse me for a minute, I lost my thing. There we go. He had more in mind than just creating. Sorry, I lost my screen for a minute. Bear with me. There we go. Like so many of these others, he thought he had something that he could actually make a living with, and he did. So he earned his living by giving tours of the carvings. Admission was 10 cents, and selling pamphlets. So again, Coral Castle, classic tourist trap. The kind of thing that, unlike Possum Trot, it probably was a little easier to get your mom and dad to stop at Coral Castle. And not only could you get to tour, but he sold books with his philosophy on life and telling the story of Coral Castle. There he is holding one of his books.
Bill, we actually aren't seeing the slides. We're just seeing you right now.
Oh, sorry. Let me reshare the screen.
It's not that we don't love you.
Yeah, no, I didn't realize I had lost the screen share. There we go. Do you see him now?
We're good.
Okay. All right. Let me I'll just so you can see the slides. So there's Edward with his admission dropped 10 cents below. He wanted to put a book in every home, so he was pretty aggressive selling his books. So the Coral Castle was perfect. It met his emotional needs, and he made a living running this tourist attraction. Here's a promotional postcard from back in the day. A similar site is the Shrine of the Pines in Baldwin, Michigan. Not necessarily emotionally similar, but another site that was built by one gentleman who had this idea that there was a lot of roots and stumps that were left over from logging. This was in Western Michigan, about halfway between Grand Rapids and Traverse City. And he decided to do something with these pieces of wood. And so he carved them. They said he made a dining table from a 700-pound stump, and about 200 other objects at the Shrine of the Pines. Raymond Overholzer was the name of the creator. He built this from the early 1920s and worked on it till he died in 1952. Like Coral Castle, it is still there. You can still visit it, at least in season. I think it's closes for the winter. There's a vintage postcard of Shrine of the Pines. Again, it's very unlikely that Overholzer believed what he was making was art. He probably just thought it was, a pretty interesting tourist attraction. But from my point of view, and the point of view of people who are interested in art, by people, especially by people who don't think of themselves as artists, he created quite a stunning work of art there in Baldwin, Michigan. There he is with some of the objects, and vintage postcard. I suspect the hours are a little different, but as I say, still closed out of season, but you can still visit it as I did some years ago. So the next one is a true example of commercial archaeology. The best example I know of, because if you look at this casually, you'll see, what clearly are, art objects, sculpture, signs. But if you look carefully, you will see this is a place called Margaret's Grocery and Market. I stumbled across this in the early 1990s when I was driving along Business 61, heading into Vicksburg, Mississippi. What what's wonderful is it's still, well, even though it had this huge artistic element to it, it was still a working grocery store, as you'll see in a minute. Inventory was a little spare inside, but they did have inventory. So the story is that this is what you're seeing. There's Reverend Dennis, that he proposed when he proposed to Martha, who actually had opened the grocery with her first husband, who was killed in a robbery. But when he proposed to Martha, he said he would build her a castle if she married him. So they married in 1979, and he built her a castle. Not incidentally, he had learned bricklaying in World War II. He was a character. If you stopped at Margaret's Grocery, he had a lot to say. Per Kelly Ludwig, who's one of the country's great experts in these kinds of places, she quotes him. She says, he said the pinks, yellows, and reds should remind people that you can't have a bouquet of flowers without different colors. We're all God's children. So he favored uplifting messages like that one. If you did stop there, he would show you around like he showed me around. This is just a wonderful shot. So on the floor he built an Ark of the Covenant. He was a preacher. His messages were largely religious, and he built this model of the Ark of the Covenant. You can't really see in these pictures, but it was sitting on pipes so you could carry it around. But if you look, of course, at the top of the picture, you will see the bounty and the tide. So this was this combination of a commercial venue, a market, which was really Margaret's contribution, and then a religious site, which was the Reverend Dennis's. I think they loved having visitors. I love the fact that Reverend Dennis incorporated Masonic imagery into this castle, into this shrine. Unfortunately, after the Reverend died in 2012, the site went into really serious decline. And you can kind of see the difference between those beautiful colors at the top and a much more recent photo. The good news is that ownership of the property has been resolved, and that restoration and preservation efforts are actively underway. If you look up Margaret's Grocery, you can get more information on that. I don't know that they'll be able to bring it fully back to what it was when the Reverend was alive, but there's a group that's working very hard to preserve this site and give a taste of what it was like back in the day. So religion, as at Margaret's Grocery, is a common theme for sites like this. And this being the United States, religion, obsession, commercialism all go together very well, and all can easily become intertwined. So Howard Finster is pretty widely known for his prolific paintings and sculptures, including his album cover for the Talking Heads, his Coca-Cola bottles. He was prolific. When he died, he started numbering every painting he made or had a hand in making pretty early on. And when he died, he had reached more than 46,000 works of art in 2001. He was a preacher, but he was also a mechanic, and he was a crafter. He at one time made a living fixing bicycles. He used to make wood burning stuff and clock cases that he would sell at flea markets. But in 1961, long before he started a career as a painter, he started creating what came to be known as Paradise Garden. This was in Somerville, Georgia, which is northwest of Atlanta. And his goal was to create a tourist attraction, was to attract tourists and expose them to his spiritual messages. And in fact, the original name, it's now called Paradise Garden, but the original name was such a great tourist trap name: Plant Farm, Museum, and Inventions of Mankind. You know, another kind of name that would tell the parents, don't stop here, even if the kids really wanted to. You may note, I have a fixation on parents not stopping, because when I was in third grade, we took a trip out west, and I saw these signs for Meteor Crater everywhere, and I begged and pleaded, and my parents said, oh no, that's just a tourist trap. And of course, Meteor Crater is a spectacular actual meteor crater in the desert in Arizona. So I'm always sensitive to parents who will not stop for tourist attractions. But anyways, Howard Finster. So there's Howard. You know, he has this wonderful quote about that he had posted at the garden. I took the pieces you threw away and put them together by night and day. He named it Paradise Garden after a 1975 Esquire magazine article that described it as a garden of paradise. I mean, it was basically the swamp that he drained and built buildings filled with artwork. And it was a major draw, certainly for art lovers, but really for anyone who wanted to go gawk. And if you were lucky, you got a chance to listen to Howard's impromptu sermons, which he would launch into at the slightest provocation. He could go on for a long time. You could pick up a souvenir artwork, which he sold from early on. Howard and his family cranked these out by the hundreds. You will note on the photo on the left, it was a tribute to a painter beloved of the SCA, John Bader, who was an early visitor clearly to Paradise Gardens. In any case, around 1976, Howard got a vision that directed him to make sacred art. So he became a painter and a sculptor, as well as a tourist attraction operator, mechanic, and environment builder. Paradise Garden is still there today. I recommend visiting it. It's operated by a nonprofit that has put a lot of effort into preservation. It takes a lot of effort to restore and preserve these sites, and they're doing a great job. So religion, again, is a common theme. Not all religious sites are commercial, although you could argue that they all depend on tourists coming by and making donations. This is one of the U.S.'s great religious sites, the Grotto of Redemption, which is even more in the middle of nowhere in Iowa than the Woolseys were. This was also one of the earliest of these kinds of grottos, and actually became an inspiration for many other people who built grottos like this, including what's now more famous, because I think it's more accessible, the Dickeyville Grotto in Dickeyville, Wisconsin. But it started with in West Bend, Iowa. I love this picture because it's not retouched. It looks just like a hand painted postcard. It's just, I'm not a photographer, but I got really lucky with the light. Rather a large site. This is essentially one side of it, and then if you go all the way through down that walkway, you would come out more or less on this other side. It was built by Father Paul Dauberstein, who was the local parish priest. He started working on this in 1912, and work continued after his death in 1954. Yeah, it's not exactly commercial, but donations are definitely encouraged. Well worth the detour. It took me years to actually get myself to West Bend, Iowa, which is not really near anything, but this is just a truly remarkable site. So Grotto of the Redemption, just to give you a sense of it, it's on the map on top, shows you where it is, well north of Des Moines, well east of Sioux City, west of Mason City, and then the map on the bottom is the next site, which is another religious site we're gonna happen on before we get back to some more commercial venues. This is a site in the middle of nowhere in the desert in California. If you're familiar with the Salton Sea and Slab City, that's where this is. It's called Salvation Mountain. It is free to view, although again, donations are always encouraged. Basically, it's Slab City is a squatter village, and Salvation Mountain is a squatter environment that was built by a gentleman named Leonard Knight. He built it in 1984. It collapsed, and then he rebuilt it in 1989. He died in 2014. There were efforts to rip it out because there was concern about its stability and the toxicity of the paint he used, but it has survived. It's still there. It's maintained by volunteers. Well worth a visit. It's not that far from Palm Springs. And if you really want to see a commercial fiasco, take the detour and drive through one of the developments along the Salton Sea and educate yourself about the Salton Sea, which is one of the country's great real estate disasters and environmental disasters. But Salvation Mountain is quite stunning religious message. So one more there's a couple more spiritual sites. This one's a beautiful one, more marginal than the ones we just saw. It was built by Eddie Owens Martin as a shrine to his own invented religion, which he called Passaquoyanism, and he styled himself as Saint Owen. He started building this when he inherited the property from his mother in the 1950s. He maintained it until his death in 1986. This is the site in 1990. So he had been dead a few years. It really wasn't being maintained, but it was still fairly fresh from the way he left it. In 2014, the Kohler Foundation, which I will say is really operates Spaces Archives, one of our partners, acquired the site and renovated it. And you can see on the right, one of the doorposts before and after it was rehabilitated by Kohler Foundation in a 2-year project. Kohler has done this for sites around the country. We'll talk a little bit more about Kohler in a minute. Their model is generally they will acquire a site, they will fix it up, and then they will turn it over to a local owner to maintain it. So you can visit Passaquan today. It's in Buena Vista, Georgia, which is how they say it, which is sort of central Georgia, right over the state line from Alabama. The reason I include it is because arguably the way I view it is that Passaquan was effectively brand advertising for Eddie Owens Martin's services, which included fortune telling for sure, and by some accounts, marijuana sales as well. So, you know, he set himself up as this eccentric in rural Georgia, and he needed something to get people to come to use his services. And so what a great way to get people to come visit you by creating a site like this one. It's fairly large. I mean, we're just seeing a portion of it. There are a number of buildings, lots of fences. You can kind of get a sense of the scale here. Well worth the detour. It's probably about an hour and a half south west of Atlanta or thereabouts. It's near Fort Benning, if that means anything to you. So that's Passaquan. Now, some environments are not religious, but do have messages. So this environment, which is one of the oldest in the United States, is really about politics. This is in Lucas, Kansas. It was built by design in a very visible location. The builder, S.P. Dinsmore, gave tours and charged admission fees from early on. So this was really, pretty clearly built as a tourist attraction in mind, but it was also a tourist attraction with a message, which in his case was very much resonant with the rural populism of the turn of the century. So very anti-banks, anti the big East Coast interest, pro-farmer, pro-working man. Dinsmore was an eccentric. I won't go into too many details, but he built himself a tomb on the site with a coffin with a glass lid so that people could come see him years after he had died. And this site is extant, well taken care of, so easy to see. Highly, highly recommend it. He also published, I should say, like Leedskelden and Coral Castle, he published booklets outlining his philosophy and the story of the Garden of Eden in Kansas. Another thematically based site, less commercial. We'll get to the hardcore commercial stuff at the end very shortly. The African American Heritage Museum and Black Veterans Archive, built by Charles Smith, a Vietnam veteran. He built this in Aurora, Illinois, outside of Chicago, started in 1986. And his goal was education and advocacy. So not commercial, but it was built as a tourist attraction. It was built to get people to come and hear his message about Black people, about war, about the history of Black veterans. He eventually moved from Aurora. The Kohler Foundation actually acquired much of the sculpture that was in the Aurora site. Some of it you can still see in Sheboygan, Wisconsin at the Kohler Museum, and they gifted a lot of it to museums around the country. But Smith ended up moving to Louisiana, where he saw a site that he thought would be perfect to recreate this environment, and he did. So in Hammond, Louisiana, you can now see the new African American Heritage Museum and Black Veterans Archive. Dr. Smith, as he's known, is still active and engaged with the public locally in Louisiana and internationally as an artist, getting his messages across. So I mentioned the Kohler Foundation. Their interest of this really, as I understand it, and there may be people on the call who can speak with more authority, started with the Wisconsin Concrete Park in Phillips, Wisconsin. So Ruth Kohler, one of the Kohler heirs, and when I say Kohler, yes, it's the toilet Kohler people, based in Kohler, Wisconsin, which is just outside of Sheboygan. When she was in her youth, she saw the Wisconsin Concrete Park, which is in Phillips, Wisconsin, north central Wisconsin, out in the North Woods. It was adjacent to the tavern of Fred Smith, the builder, and it not incidentally promoted the tavern. So there's Fred in later years with one of his sculptures. So he filled the yard next to his tavern with sculptures, or in this case, what any good tourist site should have, a wayfinder, where you could figure out and see exactly how far away you were from all the sites and attractions in northern Wisconsin. You know, there's a broader view of it, of Wisconsin. He called it the Wisconsin Concrete Park. But there's his tavern. You can see it in the back. The building's still there. The tavern, it no longer operates as a tavern. So Ruth Kohler was, loved this site, and it really sparked her interest in all sites like this. And the Kohler Foundation has become probably in the world the most important advocate for sites like this, and certainly the most important entity dedicated to preserving them, to saving them and preserving them. In the case of the Concrete Park, it's now overseen by the Friends of Fred Smith. As you can imagine, if you look at these pieces, this requires a lot of maintenance, and many of these sites do. If you leave them out in the open air, they tend to fade away and eventually deteriorate. This site has been damaged by windstorms in the past, but the work of many volunteers has really kept it alive and brought it back to life. Unfortunately, Ruth died in 2020, but her legacy really lives on through the Kohler Foundation. And if you ever make it to Sheboygan, what was her final project called the Art Preserve, which is a place where they take a lot of objects from sites like these that that either can't or won't be saved on site, and they've installed them in this wonderful building that's sort of halfway between Sheboygan and Kohler, Wisconsin, which is where the Kohler factory is. Anyways, a couple more sort of general sites, and then we're almost done. There's a whole genre of sites that I like, that you can call sorehead sites. So Fred Smith built a happy place, but there are a lot of sites that aren't so happy. One of them, is an example, is the Cross Garden, which really was not built as a tourist attraction as much as a religious harangue. It was built by a gentleman named W.C. Rice. This is in Prattville, Alabama, which is just a little bit west of Montgomery, Alabama. You can kind of see the tenor of his messaging. Too late in hell, firewater. There's signs that said in hell from sex used wrong way. I don't know if they're visible in these pictures. Well, the funny thing is, Rice was pretty harsh in his religious views. He filled this whole lot next to his house and much of his yard with these harangues. But reportedly, he was said to be really friendly and welcoming to visitors. I, however, was afraid to find out, so I never rang the doorbell. I just took pictures of the site. The site is kind of still there, although I think it's not quite in the same condition that it was back in the 90s when these were shot. I should just note the original Sorehead Hill was in Fulton, Missouri, built by a man named Jesse Howard, who had a lot of grievances against his neighbors, his family, his town, and he filled his site with a lot of angry signs. These photos were taken, by the way, by Roger Brown, who you may have heard of, was a very well-known artist in Chicago in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, who was very interested in places like that. That's Jesse. But now we're going to end, though, with a couple of actual, sort of like Margaret's Grocery, only a little more purely commercial in intention. And this is what I like to call art in the environment. These are places that were not intended to be roadside tourist traps, or certainly not art sites, but because of the way the owners decided to promote their businesses, they really became inadvertent works of art while serving their promotional function. So this is Frank's West Side Auto Parts. This is in Chicago on the southwest side of Kedzie Avenue and I think 31st Street. Anyways, south side of Chicago. And it's a junkyard, but it's a junkyard where the owners has covered it with these works of art, portraits of presumably people who work there, or maybe the owners. The site is surrounded by fences that are covered with artwork. The building itself arguably is a work of art between the typography and the color choices and the portraits. You can see not only is there the portrait on the left, but on the front of the building, you can kind of see in that sign that there are portraits there as well. All kinds of just random images. I mean, this one is relevant to the business, but you also see like football players, just, wonderful works of art. It's still there, at least within, the last time I went, not too many years ago. And, there's more than I have time to show, but, beautiful site, and shows what a commercial operation can do when they have space and they have neighbors, I guess, who don't complain. And then we'll end with this site, Regency Auto Sales. Sadly, this is long gone. These photos are from the early 1990s, which you can tell from the cars. So this was a used car lot on Western Avenue on the far south side of Chicago. Again, this is a case where, used car dealer undoubtedly didn't think of what they were doing as any kind of art, but presumably they commissioned someone. Unfortunately long gone. So the creator of this is anonymous, the artist is anonymous, but they covered this used car lot with these wonderful paintings of drivers, of salesmen, again, wonderful typography, just over the top signage, or beyond what, most businesses would think would be necessary for normal promotion. So Regency Auto Sales, only place you can visit it now, as far as I know, is on my website. But it was a lovely spot. And, that's kind of it for the slide portion of this presentation. Hopefully it was commercial enough to satisfy the SEA criteria and artistic enough for the art folks, but, happy to discuss and answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Bill. That was an absolutely excellent presentation. Very, it's intriguing. It's just the breadth and depth of stuff there. It's just crazy. We have had a lot of comments, and so I will start reading them out. Now, many of these comments are ones where people are suggesting other places that are should be on your list as well. So I'll start with those ones, and let me get back to you here in the thing. So there, somebody, Diane Lapp, or sorry, Larry Cantor is saying there was a similar Michigan attraction is Legs In. Have you been to that one?
I have been to that one. I don't have any pictures of it, but yes.
A few people actually said, love the Legs In Michigan. Jean Mercer Ballard said that.
So for the record, the next, I'll jump ahead to the next comment. I don't know if it's still the case, but as of about a month ago, Peterson Rock Garden was for sale. So if you want to own one of these sites, look it up, because it was for sale. It could easily have been included here, Peterson Rock Garden. But yes, it was for sale. It's a wonderful site. There's a similar site in Columbus, Ohio, called Hartman Rock Garden, which is another site that Kohler Foundation renovated. I mean, it's not uncommon to find these like rock gardens, and these are places where people, build model buildings and create like whole villages out of rocks. So yeah, Peterson Rock Garden.
Stephanie Stuckey says there's a couple of Airbnbs on site at Howard Finster's. That's on her bucket list to stay there, as a matter of fact. So you can actually stay at Howard Finster's if you want to. Yep. And also at Pasaquan in Buenos.
We talked about that before. I think Stephanie made the comment before we got there.
Okay.
John Bader is still posting regularly on Instagram. So, I don't think his health is great, but you absolutely should. He has a couple different accounts on Instagram. Highly recommend following him. He posts his postcards pretty regularly.
Stephanie has made a good comment where she goes, because you had a great line about your begging your parents to stop at the Meteor site and they wouldn't do it. She goes, I'm a Stuckey, so we grew up stopping at every roadside attraction, which might be a little bit too far the other way. I'm going to just scroll down here to Somebody says, I need to go to Watts. All of this reminds me, this is Constant Walters, of Dick and Jane's spot in Ellensburg, Washington, I guess. You know that one?
That's a new one on me.
Constance, are you still online? You could unmute yourself and tell us about it if you're there. No, Constance. Okay. We also have, let me see, I'm just
Okay,
scrolling.
I will, my friend Richard Moore made a comment that is probably strictly speaking true. You do not, talking about Pasaquan, you don't need this degree of extravagance to sell pot at a religious site. Yes, I think you're right, but based on Eddie's penchant for performance and display, I think there was an advertising element to it as well. And again, I think primarily he was a fortune teller and a seer, not which jives with the religious angle. The pot is, I'm not even sure that, I don't know how fully true that is, but that's certainly what I heard. But anyways.
Rochelle Kolankowicz says the Sandman's Garden in Birmingham, Alabama is another one. Do you know that one? Sandman's Garden?
Yeah, Lonnie Holly is the artist. He originally built this vast site next to the airport, and it was condemned when they expanded the airport. But I've never been to his environment, but he's an interesting character because he's wholly self-taught, came from a disadvantaged background, and today he's basically a contemporary artist, meaning he shows at his work is shown at art museums. He's participates in the mainstream art world as an artist. He's also a musician. He's recorded albums. You know, very, very, very powerful artist. Very interesting person.
Richard Moore says, is there stuff like this in other countries, or is this America?
There is
being America.
And in other states. I mean, Wisconsin, you don't have to go to the country, just go to Wisconsin, and there are so many sites. But yes, now it varies from place to place, but really in a way you could argue that in terms of modern world, the original site of these kind of sites is in France, in a little town called Haute-Rives, France, which is called the Palais Ideal of the Factor Cheval. Cheval was a postman who collected rocks on his route and built this amazing site in this little town in France in the late 19th century. You know, created it's compact, but a pretty substantial large building full of, you know, sculptures, rooms. That was a favorite of the early modernists, of the surrealists and their predecessors. So well known in France in the early 20th century. And there are other sites like that in France. There aren't so many, you know, they're scattered around Europe. But I can tell you the country with the best documented sites of all the sites like this is Spain. And the reason is that I don't know that it's because there were more sites in Spain, but the former director of Spaces lives part of the year in Spain, and she has done an incredible job documenting hundreds and hundreds of sites like this in Spain, and has published a book that's called Singular Spaces. That's just an incredibly great book. Highly recommended if you like sites like this. Now, these are mostly not commercial. They're mostly highly personal, but I highly recommend it. So Jo Farb Hernandez is her name, and she has photographed and done and written the stories of dozens and dozens of these sites in Spain in particular, but they are scattered around the world. There are some, you know, and they resonate with sites that are pre-modern. So I would argue if you go to Cambodia and go to Angkor Wat, you know, there's some resonance between those sites and some of these sites in certain ways. But yeah, they're around the world, but there are states and countries that seem to have concentrations of them. Sometimes it's because someone sees one nearby and is inspired to build their own. That's what happened in Wisconsin. People saw the Grotto of Redemption, came back, built the grotto in Dickeyville. People would go to Dickeyville, and there are these little grottos scattered around Wisconsin that people were just motivated to make.
I can also say, Bill, that I live in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I've not seen a lot of
I
this kind of
lost you.
thing in
I lost.
Canada.
Oh, I'm sorry, Brian. Sorry, my sound got turned off.
Oh, I was just saying that I live in Toronto, Canada, and I don't see much of this in Canada, to be honest with you. But there used to be a store, a discount department store called Honest. And if anybody's been to Toronto or lived in Canada for a while, they'll know of it. And it was covered with signs like this. I mean, they're a little more professional, but all sorts of crazy messages like only the floors are crooked at Honest Ed's and all this kind of thing. Unfortunately, it's gone now, been replaced by a condo, but I believe the city required the developers to save the signs, and they're going to be remounted somewhere. But of course, it just won't be the same.
So I see someone mentions Rockholm Gardens, which is in Southern Illinois, which unfortunately was acquired and, as far as I know, has been redeveloped as a housing development. So it might have fit in to this. It was sort of halfway between these kind of sites and a more traditional tourist attraction. It was sort of a Amish themed theme park, which is an odd concept. I can think of a couple other questions. Yeah, the Beer Can House and Orange Show in Houston are some of the more famous examples of sites like this, which have been very lovingly preserved. They sponsor the annual art car parade in Houston. So highly recommended if you're in Texas if you're in Houston. I've driven by the Beer Can House. I have to confess, I get to Houston rarely, so I've not yet been to the Orange Show. Someone mentioned Prophet Isaiah's Second Coming House in Niagara Falls. I have not been there. I've seen pictures there. It's a wonderful site that I believe Kohler is involved in preserving, because Prophet Isaiah died within the last couple of years. So this is a religious themed site, very colorful. I hope to get to it next time I'm in the Niagara Falls area.
Do you know the painter? We had a comment from Claire McDermott, says there's a great sign painter here in Chicago called Right Way Signs. They do great classic work. Do you know them, Bill?
I mean, I've seen the name, but I'm not that current on sign painters. I follow the signs. I have to admit, unlike, let's say, Deborah Jane Seltzer, who's on this chat, I admire her willingness to do the research. I envy and admire, because I have thought about trying to reach out to some sign painters over the years, but have not done so.
I'm quite interested in Ali Sponger's comment about Prophet Isaiah's Second Coming House in Niagara Falls, New York, because as you know, the SCA conference will be in Niagara Falls in 2025. And so we'll definitely have to put that on the list. I've been to Niagara Falls, New York lots of times, and I've never seen it, never even heard of it.
Well, it's a fairly recent site. There are probably some other things to talk about above. I will skip to one of my favorite subjects, which is one of the last comments, which is House on the Rock.
Right.
So,
yes.
House on the Rock is, I mean, I lived in Wisconsin for a few years. I've been to House on the Rock. It's a fascinating story. It's in a category of its own. And I put it there because most of these sites that we have seen, in fact, almost all of them, were built by people who didn't think of themselves as artists, who didn't think what they were making was art at all. House on the Rock was a very conscious effort to create objects, in many cases, objects that were counterfeits that were presented as artwork, but were actually fakes that were crafted by professionals across the street. Now, that said, I don't mean to diminish House on the Rock. It is the whole idea of that is incredible, that someone would go to that trouble to create all these faux antiques. I think there's some real ones mixed in, but my understanding is most of it is faux antiques to create this bizarre tourist attraction. But it is sort of its own thing, not exactly in the same case. You know, there are so many great suggestions that people are posting on here. Vala Simpson's Whirligigs, which are now in Wilson, North Carolina. I saw them when they were in the original site. These are giant, like multi-story windmills that Vala Simpson created in rural North Carolina. Temple of Tolerance, I visited that for the first time just like a year or two ago. Just there's so many sites that are all over the country. If you start looking for them, they aren't hard to find. And in fact, what I failed to do on my slide was go to the last slide.
There you go.
So if you want to find sites like this, there are the two places to go are Spaces Archives, which is very extensive, has hundreds and hundreds of sites in the United States and around the world, or Larry Harris's Narrow Larry's World of the Outstanding. Between those two websites, you will be able to find information and maps on just dozens and dozens and dozens of these sites. So I recommend those sites very highly. You can also go to my own site, interestingideas.com, where I have quite a few photos and whatnot. But Spaces and Narrow Larry far outstrip what you would find on my site in terms of finding these sites. And again, people who did, like Deborah Jane, the research, a lot more research than I have done. Yeah, so.
I had a comment from Constance Walters. She was unable to unmute herself. Now I fixed that. Constance, if you want to come on and say something, now's the time to do it. You should be able to unmute yourself, or anybody else that would like to ask Bill a question or make a comment. There's Constance. Go ahead.
Yes, hey, I unmuted myself. Yes. Anyhow, Dick and Jane Spot is in Ellensburg, Washington, which is in the center of the state. And neither of them are alive anymore, but he did so much reflector art that it was, he used reflectors around large venues such as museums and coliseums and stuff like that, kind of patented that type of art, and then created this really crazy, wild, weird spot in Ellensburg. And it's so popular that you just type in, you can even type it in on your Google map and it'll take you right there. It's worth seeing. They have passed away, but it is now run by, I believe, 40 different artists keep it up. So that's how unique it is. So thank you for letting me talk about that.
Yeah, many of these sites you can find on Google Maps. Like someone mentioned Mary Knoll's house in Fox Point, Wisconsin. If you type in Mary Knoll in Google Maps, you will find it. That's a wonderful site. Mary Knoll was a trained artist. Unfortunately, access to her yard art, her environment is somewhat limited, meaning you can drive by it, but you can't stop because the neighbors do not approve. It's another site that's owned by who? Kohler Foundation, which has preserved the site. Wonderful place, but access remains limited because it's basically on a cul-de-sac on Lake Michigan in a suburban subdivision. The neighbors don't love visitors. But one other thing I will suggest, besides all these like sort of over the top spectacular extravaganzas, sometimes you just find these sites, much more modest sites, driving along the street. I mean, Constance mentioned the reflector art thing. Years ago, I was driving north of Cairo, Illinois, just on a blue highway, and I have a couple of pictures on my website of someone who filled he had a house trailer and he filled his yard with oil cans on sticks and whirligigs that he bought at the store, but dozens and dozens of them. So it's just like a yard that was just completely packed. It wasn't, again, no great statement. I'm sure it's long gone, but, sometimes you will find these things. The South is full of, if you go to the right places, sites that, are known in the trade as yard shows. People who decorate, create bottle trees, lay out furniture in their yard in an artful way. Sometimes there's a spiritual intent, sometimes a political intent. So you can find these on your own, but go to Spaces and Narrow Larry's and you can find the really the monumental ones as well. Worth any road trip.
We have a question here, Bill, from Tristan von Berg, who says, are there any contemporary examples from the last couple of years that reflect more modern themes?
Well, I mean, I would say you saw one of them, which is Charles Smith, who again is actively maintaining his site in Hammond, Louisiana. Prophet Isaiah. I mean, it's a religious site, but that one's pretty recent. And there's a place in, I believe it's Memphis, called Billy Tripp's Minefield, that I believe he is still maintaining. So there are, but it's hard to keep up. You hear about these things haphazardly. There's no central registry for them, so you kind of hear about them through word of mouth, and someone writes about them. But they do exist. I mean, they continue to exist. You asked about overseas. There's in a little town north of Marseille, there's it's known as the House of She Who Paints, which is an artist who has intensely decorated both the outside and inside of her house. Just an amazing site. It's just in a little town, north of Marseille, a little narrow house that she continues to maintain and work active. She's in her 80s, but works actively on it. We'll show you around, although it helps if you know French, because she doesn't speak English. So there are, sites like these that the artists are still maintaining and still building, and I'm sure there will be new ones. But like I say, you kind of hear about them haphazardly.
There's a famous one, which you didn't show, but I'm sure most people are familiar with it, called the Heidelberg Project in Detroit, Michigan as well, which is a whole street of houses that have been covered with cast-offs and things that were destined for the landfill. And it's absolutely fascinating, although it's going through some, I think, evolution right now.
And the creator of that really resonates most with the Cadillac Ranch, meaning it was created by, he's a contemporary artist who created the Heidelberg Project, and it was created as an art project, as opposed to most of the sites we're seeing here, which were not created to be art in the first place. But yeah, the Heidelberg Project, I mean, is an amazing place, amazing creativity, really, and he's a remarkable artist who's expanded into other things since he made his name with the Heidelberg Project. Kyrie is his name.
Yeah, it's oh my goodness, on the tip of my tongue. It'll come to me. Anyways, we have Dean Milano asked for a minute to say something. Dean, please unmute yourself and come on.
Okay, I'll try to be real quick. I've been to House in the Rock, many times, and the cool thing about House in the Rock is it is a museum, but it's a personal museum. It's not like going to a federally funded museum. Everything is so organized. It's just totally crazy. This guy just put anything he wanted in there, and it's fabulous. And to expand on what you were saying about the replicas, is he had a big display of the crown jewels, big sign, see the crown jewels, with a big line to see them. And my friends were all in line. I went to the front, and I saw a little sign there that said, "These are replicas of the crown jewels." And I said real loudly to my friends, "You guys, these aren't real, they're just replicas." And all of a sudden, the whole line just dissipated, and everybody walked away. I felt bad about it because
House on the Rock is amazing. What I love about it, there he put up a sign. What I love is that in most cases there is no sign, but they are still replicas. And I just find that just adds to me to the eccentricity of it, that he went to the trouble of creating all these, instead of just buying antiques, which especially when he was building the House on the Rock, you could get it, they were a dime a dozen. He created replicas. By the way, as long one last site I will mention, since we're talking about Wisconsin, is north of Madison in Baraboo. Highly recommend Dr. Evermore's Forevertron. Unfortunately, Tom Every, who created it, died not too long ago. But that's another. He basically was a junk dealer who created these large scale sculptures in a side lot. This is about 45 minutes north of Madison. So if you ever are around there, check out the Forevertron. It is well worth your while.
The
Yeah,
SCA tour went there about 3 years ago. That one tour up in Wisconsin.
That's right.
They took us there, and it was fabulous.
It was
And as a side
amazing.
note, real quick, someone mentioned getting the Blue Highways, and I want to say that I wrote a song called "Take the Blue Highway," which is on one of my CDs, and it's been played all over the world and radio stations all over the world. And you and Billy, how many people have contacted me and said, "Thank you so much for your song. We have listened to your advice, and we are taking the Blue Highways on our vacations now, and it's wonderful." So it's actually working. The song has actually gotten to a lot of people, which is pretty cool. So.
Okay, thanks very much, Dean. I'd like to, we're at almost at 9:15, so that's our closing time. And I think we've been through most of the comments. I'd like to thank again, Bill, for his top-notch presentation, absolutely fascinating. And the audience, and which, by the way, Bill, we had estimated about 80 people coming tonight, and based on our the number of people that generally show up as a percentage of those that have registered, we hit 97. Our limit is 100, so we were getting a little nervous. We were going to have to turn some people away. So I guess we have to recalculate our percentages now. But anyways, very successful presentation and very popular.
Thanks, everybody.
I'd like to remind everybody about next month when on Wednesday, February 15th at 8 p.m. Eastern and 7 Central, 5 Pacific, as Brian Butko takes us on the Lincoln Highway from New York to San Francisco, past mountaintop lookouts, through the gumbo of Iowa, and stopping at vintage cafes and cabin courts. SCA and Lincoln Highway Association members will be receiving the relevant details and registration links by email, and others can register through the website directly. Thank you to everybody who joined us tonight, spending some time with us. If you're not a member of the SCA now, expect an email shortly inviting you to join and enjoy all the benefits of membership if you enjoyed tonight's presentation. And also keep in mind that tonight's presentation will be available on the SCA website within a couple of days. And anybody can watch it there again. And if you want to refer it to friends, then friends will be able to watch it as well. So with that, was there anything else you wanted to add, Bill, before we close it off?
Nope, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for attending. And I will bid you all a good night and until next month.